Good morning. Welcome to Criminal Justice Insider. I'm Babz Rawls. And Jeff Grant is not with us today. He's not feeling well. He's having something done. And so I don't want to tell all his business, but he'll be back on the next show. And I know he's listening in, so hello. So our good friend Andrew Kaplan is riding shotgun with me today. Hey, Andrew.
Hello. I'll do my best to follow in Jeff's footsteps.
You're doing fine. So we are delighted and excited to have James Forman Jr. on today to talk about his book, Locking Up Our Own: Crime and Punishment in Black America. So welcome, James Forman.
Thank you. Thanks for having me.
So let me tell people this show is sponsored by the Community Foundation, now more than ever, and Family Reentry. And they have a tagline, but Jeff usually says the tagline. So thank you, Family Reentry. Thank you, Community Foundation for Greater New Haven, for sponsoring today's conversation. All right. You've been all over the place with this book. I love the book. It's a great book. It's an interesting book. Tell us why you are compelled to talk about this book. Can you hear me?
Yeah, I can hear you. Yeah, a lot of it really came out of my experience in Washington, D.C., as a public defender, because I went to D.C. to become a public defender, thinking of it, as I still do, as the criminal justice system is a civil rights issue of my generation, of our generation. And when I got to D.C., there was an additional layer, an additional complication that I was facing and that my colleagues faced, which is that Washington, D.C. local courts have so many African Americans in positions of power and authority. 40% of the judges, the police force is majority black, the police chief is black, the mayor's black, the city council president was black. And even with all that African American representation in the criminal system, we still had some of the same racial disparities that I saw around the country. And so I really was wrestling with this question of, how was it that in a majority black city with some amount of local control, not enough and not complete by any stretch, but how was it that we were making so many of the same policy choices that the nation was making? How was it that we were adopting mandatory minimums, that we were doing this aggressive stop and frisk policing? What was the motivation behind that? And what were the implications of that in the black community? And so I felt like I wanted to write a book that looked at what's happened in the last 50 years in our criminal justice system, but write it through the lens of a set of officials that I feel like haven't gotten very much voice. That is to say, African-American elected officials, black judges, black prosecutors, black police officers, black citizen activists. I wanted to show all the debates and the disagreements and the complexity and the arguments that take place. It's kind of like dinner table arguments that people in our community are used to having, but those happen also in the political sphere. And I wanted to elevate that and show that complexity. And so that's why I was motivated to do it. And I felt like nobody had written a book through that lens before. There'd been books written about the criminal system, for sure, important, powerful books, but no one had written it through the lens and through the eyes of black elected officials.
And that's where I'm most in awe of, because we have Michelle Alexander's book,
Yep.
We have Ava DuVernay's film,
Yep.
right, and we have all these sort of kinds of conversations. But no one has brought the black voice into it and our role, so to speak, in this issue. And I don't think, I want to ask you, do we as black people, do you think that we should have been thinking all we want is our communities to be cleaned up without consequences of what that meant? Because when we said that, because I read your book, I was reading some of the book, and I lived this story because I grew up here in New Haven. I grew up in Church Street South, and it was a crazy place in the 80s. How did we as black people not be thoughtful about how our young people were being locked up? How did we? That's the troubling part for me when we say, because when white people say, I want drugs out of my neighborhood, or drugs don't get in our neighborhood, I don't see white kids getting locked up like that. But when we said it, it just became this. We sent our kids away. My brother went to prison for 10 years. I have a half brother who went for 20. So on drugs, not anything other than drugs. So how do we reconcile that our part in this hyper mass incarceration story?
Well, I just want to pick up on one thing. You talked about growing up in New Haven, and we'll probably circle back to this, but even though the book is mostly focused on Washington, D.C., and I look at black elected officials in other cities, Atlanta, Detroit, Los Angeles, but it's not limited to that city.
No, it's not.
When I first moved to New Haven, one of the first things that I did, and I still do, is along with law students, we represent kids that are facing suspension and expulsion from school here in New Haven.
Wow.
And for, school discipline violations, it could be anything from possession of marijuana, fight in the classroom, cafeteria, you name it. And one of my first case, I had just arrived, and the first case we had, he was facing 180 days of expulsion from school. And the lawyer who was arguing for his expulsion on behalf of the school board was African American. And the hearing officer who had to make the decision in the case also was African American. And I had just come from D.C., where I was used to that.
Now you were thinking, I'm in New Haven, it's going to be different.
And I was like,
it's New Haven, it's Connecticut.
Right, and to be clear, I'm not saying that was representative.
Front door of Yale.
I'm not saying that was representative, right? I'm not saying that every hearing was like that, but it's true that was my first hearing, and I was like,
wait a minute.
And I saw some of the same things. I mean, we fought hard, but my client in that case, he was expelled from school, and I think it was for really something very minor, but which I won't go into the details here. But to get to your question, right? What's going on? So part of it is what you just said. You talked about Church Street South and being crazy in the 1980s. There's a sense of fear, a real sense that people want their neighborhoods to be safe. That's first and foremost. People do want safety, and people are angry when their sense of safety is violated. They're angry when the grandmother who's on her way to church or on her way to the NAACP meeting is robbed or shot or for nothing. People, it makes people kind of vindictive, and they say, we have to get rid of these folks that are causing all this damage to our community. Okay, so that's part of it. Is a real sense of fear, and I think a legitimate sense of fear. Now, part of it, though, is we have these class divisions. We have respectability politics at play. We have a lot of folks who get into positions of power and authority, and they say, listen, you out there who are committing this criminal mayhem, misconduct, selling drugs, buying drugs, whatever it is, you're threatening all of us. You threaten the whole race by your actions and your attitudes. You make us look bad. And that's an impulse that I think we really have to resist, And then other thing that I'll say that I want to put out there is, and not fully in defense of the people that I'm writing about, but partially in defense, is that I think over the last 40 or 50 years, you saw black elected officials asking state governments and asking the federal government for what I call all of the above to fighting crime and violence. They wanted police and prosecutors, and unfortunately, in my opinion, they sometimes even wanted more prisons. But they also wanted more money for jobs and more money for schools and more money for health care, more money for drug treatment. They wanted a Marshall Plan for urban America. They wanted a whole package of investments that were going to make communities safe. But what they got from the larger society was the law enforcement.
Yeah.
So that, I think we have to bring that into the conversation as well. Like I said, not to kind of exculpate people, but to put their choices in context.
So were we wrong to think, coming out of the 70s with the largest number of elected black folks ever, were we wrong to think that there was an expectation that somehow or other that would level the playing fields about how we would be in America? Like, were we wrong to think were we wrong to expect that?
Well, I don't know if anybody really fully expected that, right? Nobody who's done any reading anyway is going to think that, American racism is going to be defeated by even the largest group of black elected officials to be elected since Reconstruction, right? Because one thing we know about racism, I mean, first of all, we had slavery in this country for longer than we haven't had slavery, which means that it's deeply embedded in the nation's history, and it's not going to be something, and I'm not even talking about Jim Crow, I'm talking about straight up slavery from 1619 to 1865, and then when you add in Jim Crow, so all that long history isn't going to be defeated, and we're not going to be on an equal playing field just because of some elections. However, I do think that there was a sense of optimism, there was a sense of hope in the 1970s that came out of that first generation of black elected officials. And I think what the story shows us is, in some way, the limits of their ability to actually create real and lasting change, because they were hemmed in so many ways. They were constrained, like we just talked about, by the fact that they didn't have the resources that they might have needed. They were also constrained, we just talked about, by class biases. They were constrained by their imaginations. They couldn't think of a solution to the problem that was outside of the paradigm of more prisons and more police. It was hard for them to imagine public health approaches. It was hard for them to imagine sending social workers instead of police officers to deal with the addiction problem, right? So those are all the kind of constraints that they were under, and that were so powerful that even with this infusion of new black political talent onto the scene, they fundamentally couldn't change the arc of what was happening in this country.
So what do you think would happen if there were more black prosecutors? Because 90% of prosecutors are white.
Yeah.
So, or could there be some backlash?
So I'm really torn about what the actual impact of increasing the representation in these areas is actually going to mean. So you're right about the prosecutor numbers. And I'm somebody that believes that we should have more African Americans in positions of authority across the board, because I think we should have an equal access to jobs, whether or not, like, I just drove by the fire station on the way down here, and I'm often struck when I drive by a fire station in New Haven that the composition of the department doesn't seem to reflect the composition of the
that's a fight in this town. That's a fight, right?
No, I know. Right. But I'm saying I just see it. Yeah. But here's the thing. I don't think that more black firefighters is going to make the fire department more effective. But I still believe in it. I don't need to believe that they're going to change how we fight fires to believe that we should have more of, you know what I mean? And so I guess I feel the same way about prosecutors. I'm not sure that more black prosecutors is going to actually change how cases are prosecuted. I'm really not. I'm hopeful. I think certainly there will be individual cases of people who are kind of particularly conscious, particularly committed. But I've seen enough examples of African-American prosecutors that are just as vindictive or just as harsh. And in some cases, they do it. See, this is the interesting thing. For some black prosecutors, they have a racial justice motivation for being harsh.
Sure.
They say, yes, I'm a conscious black person. I took this job because I want to fight for black people. And what that means for me is fighting for that black victim of crime who's in my office, who historically would have been ignored by the law enforcement. So I'm gonna ask for a harsher sentence.
That's true. As a matter of fact, you illustrate that with Curtis Walker with his Martin Luther King speech.
Yeah, I mean the story that I used to open up the book is a story that in some ways is I cite it as my motivation for writing the book, but it's exactly that thing you described. I was representing a 15-year-old client who was charged with possession of gun and marijuana, and he had pled guilty and he was facing sentencing. And I asked for probation.
Right.
The prosecutor asked for him to be locked up. The judge, who's an African-American judge, I call him Curtis Walker. It's not his real name. I changed his name. But it's a real story, and he looks out at my client, and he says, as you just said, he said, son, Mr. Forman's been telling me that you've had a tough life and that you deserve a second chance. Well, let me tell you about tough. And he tells him about Jim Crow, because the judge had been a child in those years. And then he kind of wraps up the story by saying, listen, people fought, marched, and died for your freedom. Dr. King died for you. And he didn't die for you to be carrying that gun and running and thugging and embarrassing your family and embarrassing your community. Right? There's a little that hint to that respectability politics. So he says, I hope you turn your life around, but today in this courtroom, actions have consequences, and your consequence is Oak Hill, which was the name of D.C.'s prison, juvenile prison. And he locked him up. And so that's a good example of exactly the point you just raised, which is somebody who is racially conscious. He's thinking about race and the history of racism. He's talking about the civil rights movement. But for him, it twists, and I think is twisted, and he ends up embracing a solution. He's right about the problem. Right. But he ends up embracing a solution that I think is more destructive than helpful. So I don't know if you add more African-American prosecutors, I don't know how much of a difference it's gonna make in the practice of what happens in court. But I do believe it is something that should happen, whether or not it makes that difference.
Well, what's interesting to me is that, we're starting to see more officers of color, black police officers. I was a police commissioner here in New Haven for several years. And so we got more black police officers. And I find that black police officers sometimes have to be harder than white police officers, or as equally harsh as white police officers, because there's this code of conduct that says, I am one of you, so therefore let me prove this. Let me show you. Let me show you that I can be, and these are my people, but I don't see that. I see, and you couple that with, I want to climb in this organization, and in order to climb, I can't be seen as somebody who wavers in the face of crime. What is that? Like, how do we handle that?
Well,
how do we think about this now?
So I think you're exactly right, and there's a chapter in the book about black police officers, and it talks about some of the things that you just mentioned, as well as the fact that. And I think you're right about wanting to climb. You're right about the pressures of kind of performing as blue, not black. And then there's also the dynamic of, for a number of the police officers, the hope was that hiring more black police officers would change how police behaved. But that was a hope that was really came from like civil rights activists. But the people that joined the police force, by and large, were folks that wanted good jobs. With good benefits. They weren't necessarily taking the job thinking, well, this is the civil rights issue of my generation. That's why I'm going to become a police department, police officer. So when you put all of that together, I think you get the dynamic that you just described, which is that a lot of black police officers perform in ways that are indistinguishable, or in some instances can even be harsher from some of their white counterparts. Now, I'm not going to say that in every case, because I've definitely encountered and worked with some African-American officers and officers of other colors as well, who really who go into it, I think, with a real sense of compassion.
Yes, absolutely.
And they really are doing this because they want, people will talk about, I grew up, it was hard for me, and I want to help my community. You do find those people. But I think what this all shows as regards, you said, what are we going to do about it? I think it shows that if we're going to change how police perform and behave and how they treat poor people and working people and people of color, that we're fundamentally going to have to change structures of policing, not just the individuals who are in the jobs. So we have to change the mission of departments so that, for example, social work is not a bad word.
And I think New Haven has moved in that. We were the first ones to start community policing. It has morphed and grown over the years, but in its first, maiden voyage, I mean, it was groundbreaking stuff. Police officers would be in the community and know people, right? They would walk the streets. They would get to know people. They would be friendly. When you saw a cop, you wouldn't be like, oh my God. You'd say, hey, how you doing? And they would be in the community, and the community would help police itself. It would help the police itself. I don't know where we are now, but.
Well, when I had a student a couple years ago who did a survey of citizen organizations, community activists around policing and what people wanted. And overwhelmingly, we really heard two things. This was 3 years ago. People said they wanted more walking beats. They wanted to see more officers walking down the street, not in their cars. And two is that they wanted a transparent process where they could state a complaint, that if they had an issue that right now, this was that, they felt like they had to go down to headquarters and it was a scary setting. Right. So that's just, I'm not saying those are necessarily the right answers. Those are the answers we heard when we talked to people in terms of what they wanted. But I think, I know was it Pastor?
Yes. He started that community policing.
Right, community policing. And I know that Esserman, in a number of ways, was committed to it.
Yes, recommitted to it, yes.
And so, I guess I view those ideas as the right ones. I think that effective community policing, I mean real community policing, not the label that you put on the police car and then you just keep doing the thing that you were doing before. But the real version is hard because it does require a culture shift in a department.
Yeah.
It means hiring new officers who are committed to that mission. Yeah. Right? Right now, it's still not, if you go talk to college students and the people that have some of the mentality that we just described, and then you say to them, so why don't you think about being a police officer? They're like, what? Police, you know what I mean? That's not who becomes a police officer. Sure. That's more for the hardcore, the military types, And until we change that perception, and get people in,
and I don't think that was always the perception, though. I think people thought that being a police officer was a noble, honorable thing, and that you could go into it and you could dedicate your life to serve. I at least that's how I imagine it,
Are you thinking like the 70s? What's the time period that you? No, I'm not disagreeing with you. I'm just trying to locate this moment.
I don't know.
I think 100 years ago. But I guess the opposite of community policing is this pretext policing.
Right.
And you have these people like Sandra Dozier get caught up in the collateral damage. So can anything be done to kind of minimize the negative effect of this type of new policing?
Well, pretext policing, right, whether it's the stop and frisk on the street or whether it's the car version, sure, which is what I write about and exists in a lot of cities, right, which is still used, but really kind of the innovation, if we can call it that, was really in the 1990s in terms of our recent history, where the idea was, listen, we want to search cars.
Sure.
Because we think that cars will have guns or drugs or evidence of contraband. Okay, how are we going to search a car? Well, first we got to stop, and then we have to get consent to search. That's the basic tactic, is pull the car over and get consent.
So think about consent, because most people agree to a search.
Oh, 95, depending on the study, anywhere between 95 to 99% of people agree.
And I know it's a complicated question, but is that the proper response?
To agree?
To agree.
Well, it's hard to say, right? I've thought about this a lot, in writing that chapter and in reading these studies, and I think to myself, okay, well, if this happens to me, and one thing, I'm African American, but I'm very, very light complected. So in a lot of ways, from a policing standpoint, I'm often treated, my experience with the police in a lot of ways is closer to a white person's experience with the police than African American experience with the police, because a lot of times they don't even, I'm either racially ambiguous or they read me as white, and that's been true ever since I was a child. I mean, I grew up in a mostly black neighborhood, and one of the things that I always noticed as a child was that I would get read in Atlanta based on who I was with.
Oh, okay.
So it was like if I was with my friends from school who are mostly black and we were together, we just got read as a group of black boys.
Yeah.
But
Sure,
if I was
sure.
with a group of white, like then I get to college in New
okay.
England and I'm with like, you know, majority white environment, and I would often get read as white because
Okay.
I'm now with a group of white guys.
Sure.
So I just want to, I feel like it's important to say that because if I'm going to make it personal, because even what I just said is the reason why what I'm going to give you is a hypothetical. I'm not stopped by the police the way a lot of my darker skinned brothers
The way
and
that I
sisters
am.
are. Exactly. Exactly. So, but if I am, I think, okay, well, what am I going to do? Would I give them consent? And I'm like, I know I don't have anything. I know what's in my car. There's nothing in my car that I'm worried about. But on principle, should I say no? Because
that's the question.
I don't believe in this style of policing.
Exactly
I know
that.
what they're doing.
Right.
I don't endorse it.
Of course not.
But the
But you'd like
dilemma
to
that
get
you all
home.
face is you want to get home.
Yes. Right.
That's right. You want to get home. And so that's why so many people do consent, because either they want to get home sooner or they want to get home at all.
Right.
And so they just say, you know what, let me allow this. And then some people also, so that's somebody that doesn't have contraband in the car.
Right.
Now, somebody that does, people say, well, why would they allow it? And there's really two things that are going on there. One is some people think, well, they might not find it.
Right.
And, but they think they're going to search. Here's the thing. People believe, based on their experience, that the police are going to search anyway, whether they agree or not. So if you think they're going to search anyway, and they ask to search, most people think, well, let me say yeah, because they might not find it. And if they do, I'll be treated better because I gave them permission.
Of course.
Than if I denied them permission. This is what people are thinking. This is a psychology behind it. And that's basically not true. The police react based on what they find, not whether you gave them consent or not. But that's why Sandra Dozier, the client that I wrote about, consented, even though she had marijuana in her glove box. Partially, she was thinking they're interested in guns because that's what they were talking about, and she knew she didn't have a gun.
Right. So why couldn't they give her a pass?
Well, in a way, they kind of did in that instance. You know that, and the reason I tell that story is because it shows how all the ways the system can really trip people up and destroy their lives. Because in her case, she was subject to this style of pretext policing because of the neighborhood she lived in. They pull her over.
Right.
They ask for consent. They're talking to her about guns. They're like, we're really worried about guns, which is what they were motivated by. And she's like, I'm not involved in that. I've got a victim of gun violence. I'm nowhere near guns. They say, can we search? She says yes. They find $20 worth of marijuana. Now, they didn't arrest her.
Right.
She points to her uniform in the back seat. She's like, please don't arrest me. I'll lose my job. They give her a citation to go to court a month later. They don't just throw the weed away, which sometimes they do, but they could have done. It would not have been within the regulations, but they could have.
Because they have some discretion, right?
Right. I mean, yes. Right. They don't technically have the it was illegal at the time to possess marijuana in D.C., so they didn't legally have the discretion. Now, and everybody will tell you, and there's lots of sociological research that especially the gun interdiction units, a lot of times they don't want to be bothered with processing the paperwork of marijuana. So they're looking for guns. They don't find a gun. Oh, excuse me. I just knocked over the headset. But they don't find a gun. They just throw away the marijuana. But in this case, they gave her a citation. And then she goes to court a month later, and the case is dismissed by the prosecutor. So in a way, you could say that's the criminal justice system exercising discretion and leniency.
Sure. Exactly right.
The problem was she needed to get off of probation at her employer. She needed to produce a certificate of clean record. And when she went to the court to get it, the arrest showed up. And she presented it to her supervisor thinking, well, I'm going to explain that it was dismissed. But the rules of that employer were, while you were a probationary employee, any arrest, regardless of whether it led to a conviction or a prosecution, was meant your termination. So she's comes to my office crying
Sure.
because she's been fired and she worked so hard to get this job. And I'm on the phone with her supervisor trying to walk it through with him and explain why. And he says he's on the phone. He says she was a good employee. I did not want to do this. But when she came with that piece of paper that showed that she had the arrest, I had no choice.
Right.
And so one of the reasons why I tell that story is that I feel like a lot of times when people announce when you hear like a new policy that's being announced by a mayor or a prosecutor, in this case, Eric Holder was the chief prosecutor in D.C. who announced this. You don't really think about all the downstream consequences, right? The policy was we have to get guns off the street. So all the citizens are not in their heads.
policy.
They're like, well, good policy.
Sure.
Let's get guns off the street. And nobody thinks about, okay, when you implement this, what's this going to mean?
On the local level. All politics is local. That's what,
Right.
people have to understand that. Like we get romanticized by the federal elections, but we never think about what that means at the ground level for us.
Yeah.
Right? Because I was an alderman here, so I know. And everything is
No, you're right. And I do, and I think so. To me, the good news about it all being local is that I actually think that this is an area where local citizens can have more of an impact in changing policies in the right way than sometimes we kind of take credit for it. Because if the problem is Washington, right? If that's our target.
But if you say Washington, that's pretty liberal, pretty diverse.
No, I mean like the federal government. If, in other words, if Trump and Sessions are who we have to change, no, exactly, right? That's the only hope there is the next election.
Yeah.
But at a more local level, is where we can have a greater impact.
Depends on where you are though, because the local level in Mississippi is going to be a different local level in Connecticut.
That's right.
Right. So
that's right. But that's true. But I think it's important for people to know that I'm going to focus only on things that have happened since November of 2016, because it's like, that was the election. So that's Trump, and Sessions comes as an attorney general. So that's kind of a low watermark for reform efforts. But even with that, in Alabama, they've changed their law to restore voting
rights.
Right, to many people who with felony convictions.
Yes.
Louisiana, which had the highest incarceration rates in the country. Now, this is in the country with the highest incarceration rates in the world, right? And they've got the highest incarceration rate in the country. They passed a major criminal justice reform overhaul, and from touching the juvenile system all the way up.
But don't you think they were already moving in that direction, though? Like they were already.
Oh yeah,
because it's expensive to.
Oh, I'm not saying. I want to be clear. I'm not saying this was that Trump and had anything to do with this. I just mean I'm more pointing out that whatever happened at the national level didn't stop it. In other words, the momentum, even in pretty conservative places. I mean, Texas has had over the last decade has reduced its prison population as much as any state in the country.
But they didn't. I mean, I don't care about the morality of it, but they did it because it was expensive, because it was a drag on their budget.
That's right. Well, some people came for that reason, and other people came for the moral reason.
Yes.
I mean, it was a coalition. You do politics, what different things bring different people in the room. But you're right that for certainly a lot of the Republicans, that was their motivation. Having said that, it's still important. It's still a win. It still means
still a win. It
still means people who aren't in prison who otherwise would have been. And the money argument, remember, the argument that this is expensive, that was being made in the 80s and 90s by advocates who are against mass incarceration, and it didn't get any purchase.
Right.
In other words,
right.
But now it's starting to, I think, because people are starting to wake up to the economic cost and the moral cost, it's starting to have an impact and to persuade some people.
So let's shift gears a little bit, because I know Andrew is interested in talking about your dad.
Yes.
Who I don't even know how you frame that, but I will say this: your mother had the presence of mind to say, "Y'all are black kids. We're gonna raise y'all with some black people. We're gonna leave the land of the white folks and go down and make sure that you have some identity." That was very forward thinking on her part, I thought.
It was, and I give her, you know, I've only told that story, I think, probably once or twice at most. But I give, in terms of like in an interview setting, I mean, I've told it to friends, but when we were growing up, so my parents split up. So my dad's black, my mom's white, and my parents split up when I was 7 and my younger brother was 4. And then my mom was then raising us in New York City. And actually the triggering event for her was I was in one of these selective admission high schools in New York. It was the one I was in, started in 7th grade. It was called Hunter College High School. And it was 7th through 12th. And she went to she got the reading list for our 7th grade year, the summer reading list, and there were no black authors on it for literature.
See, because they didn't know your mama was like in SNCC, right?
Right.
They wasn't ready for that.
But SNCC or not, they needed to not be doing this. So she went up there and complained, and they were like, well, why don't you recommend some authors? And she says, I'm a nurse. Y'all are the English department.
Sure.
You get some people on here. This is your job. It's not my job to propose, great. And on her way out the door, of course, she's muttering, and she's like this shouldn't be hard, you know. How about Toni Morrison, Langston Hughes, James Baldwin? You know, she's walking out the door giving like the litany of the greats. And so she just was really kind of, I think that was the triggering thing for her, but it had been building. And so she decided to move us to Atlanta, which is where she and my dad met in SNCC. And she had a couple friends there, and she knew of it as a city with this, you know, there was a black majority city with this kind of robust black political class and intellectual class and artistic and not, you know, that exists in New York too, but there's something in Atlanta about kind of the numbers.
Yes.
And so,
yes.
So she just said, I'm going to raise my boys there because I'm a white woman raising 2 black sons.
Mm-hmm.
And I need them to grow up in a setting where they understand their history, and I'm going to teach them. I'm going to do my best. I'm going to teach them and all of that. And my dad was involved in our lives, but she just wanted us to kind of see it on the day-to-day level. Mm-hmm. And I was mad. I did not want to move when she moved us. I really did not. But I then later credit it as one of the great parenting decisions that she ever made.
Absolutely. Because when you're down there in Atlanta, you're black, and everything is black. It's not just, it's not like ballet and then black ballet.
Exactly.
Right? It's not just art and then black art. It's art, ballet, music. Everybody's black. And so, you know, you don't have to call it anything other than, you don't have to preface it with black before whatever it is. And so my sister went to Spelman, so I spent a lot of time in Atlanta.
Yeah. It's a special place.
It is. It is.
You know, so I was very, very impressed by Fab because, I mean, he really was a true scholar, and more than just being the executive secretary for SNCC. He had multiple degrees, had a PhD, wrote many books. My question is, was he happy with the progress that African Americans have made in the past 40 years? And then how did it influence you as a child growing up?
So one of the things about my dad is that he was unbelievably optimistic. And that's the person that I always knew was a person who just believed that if we kept working at it, that we would be able to turn things around.
And he worked very hard at it.
He did. He worked hard at it. He worked hard his entire life. And so I guess I would say, I mean, he wasn't satisfied with the progress, but he was the kind of person who he always focused on the progress, and he always focused on, okay, well, here's the next thing that we need to work on. And so like when somebody would say, oh, you know, it's ridiculous. Here we are 30 years after the civil rights movement, let's say we're talking 1990 or something, or 20 years, 25 years after the civil rights movement, and, black people still are faced discrimination and going looking for jobs and when looking for houses, his reaction would always be, okay, so what are we going to do about that? Let's get going.
Right.
That was just that's just how he was made. And so there was no value in spending any time complaining to him, because the move was always going to be, all right, so what's next?
Mm-hmm.
And so I don't know in a way whether I called him optimistic when you first asked. Really, maybe the way is it's like optimism versus pessimism is almost irrelevant to it. Maybe it's really just that he was so action oriented and so next step focused that whatever position you took, he was then moving to, okay, what are we gonna do?
So do you feel like you carry the weight of your dad? Because I look at the King kids, I look at Malcolm X's kids, I look at the Eggers children. Do you feel the weight of the history and the depth of all of that?
Not in a bad way. So, I know some of those, kids that you mentioned as well. And there could be gatherings like SNCC, we'll have gather SNCC veterans, and sometimes the younger generation will carve out and have a little session. And one thing that's become clear to me over the years is that for the people whose parents were really famous, there's a unique burden. I'm in a way blessed by the fact that my dad was kind of famous enough that people who know what was going on know his name. Mm-hmm. So in a way, when people know, if you know my dad, or if you walk in the room with my dad's book, right, the way Andrew did, that tells me something. I already know something good about you, which is different for the King children.
Yeah.
The person, it doesn't mean anything. That's not a filter. You might be coming in, you might want their money. Who knows what you want? You know what I mean? But for me, if you know my dad, if you have his book, then that means, you're well read, you're deeper than just the cover.
Right, but more people should know about your father.
Well, I'm not going to disagree with that. I'm not going to disagree with that at all. I just mean that your question was, how has it impacted me?
Mm-hmm.
And for me, it's made it kind of pure blessing, because I get the energy of his contribution, and I get the benefit of, the fact that his name does open some doors for me, but I don't get any of that baggage of, I'm never going to be able to live up to my dad kind of thing, which I think is really hard.
I think so.
For a lot of those other kids that we just talked about.
Mm-hmm. I agree. So your father, we have the making the Black Revolutionaries, and he discusses...
Get closer to the mic.
and he discusses setting up voter registration schools. Now we have your book, 40 years later, where you're an African-American president. When your son follows the tradition and writes the book, what will his story be about African-Americans in our country?
Oh, well, his story is going to be the generation that dismantled mass incarceration.
That's fantastic.
I like that. Was your dad a good dad to you?
He was. Yeah. He was. So he's complicated. We
all are complicated, and our parents are even more so, right?
Right, exactly. So, I'm just trying to give you a real answer. He was, we lived with my mom, not with him. He was absolutely committed to us, cared for us, loved us. He wasn't the dad who was going to change everything. Some parents, my mom was kind of this way. She became interested in what we were interested in. Sure. My dad was interested in what he was interested in. And he wanted to work with you on that.
Yes.
So if you wanted to come to the office and fill out envelopes for a mailing, he was all in. But he wasn't going to learn about soccer or football. Okay. He wasn't doing that.
Yeah.
So he was wonderful, and he had his limits.
Sure.
Wow, that's a wonderful thing. Is there another book in you?
I think so, but my wife has she has made me promise that for the next year or two that I'll focus on. I do a lot of public speaking, so that I'll focus on events and like op-eds and essays and things that are shorter in length and
don't take
become
you far
as all,
away. Yeah.
Don't become as all-consuming
Yeah.
as writing this book did.
Yeah. Yeah.
It was tough for the family.
Do you live in New Haven?
Yes.
Does
Yes,
your
so
child go to school here?
Yes, he goes to New Haven Public Schools. He goes to Worthington Hooker.
Okay, I know that school well.
So after reading your book, what can the average person do to make things better for everyone?
Well, I think there's so much. I mean, if we're talking in Connecticut in particular.
We're all local.
Yeah, so I mean, in Connecticut, there's a bunch of things that are going on right now. First of all, Connecticut is one of the states that's made a lot of progress in reducing the size of its prison system. People that want to go further, there's right now a big project that's building towards registering to people to vote, including registering to people who are formerly incarcerated and justice involved. Because one of the things is that a lot of people come out of prison and they don't even realize that they do have the right to vote. So there's two things that are going on right now. One, people are working to change the law. Connecticut's the only state in New England where you can't vote automatically once you get out of prison. In other New England states,
You can't. I voted when I got out.
but if you were in Connecticut, as long as you're on parole, you cannot vote.
I was on
Once you're
probation.
off probation.
You can.
You can.
But parole, you
But
can't.
parole, you can't.
Yes.
So there's been a bill in last legislative cycle and will be reintroduced to change that, to bring
Yes.
us in line with other states, which is to say parole or probation. Once you're out of prison,
Yes.
you should be able to register and
and
participate.
participate. Yes.
And participate. So that's something. But then just along the lines of, for people that are more interested in kind of more the day-to-day knocking on doors, there's going to be a bunch of Super Saturdays and other campaigns where neighborhoods that have a lot of folks who are out of the prison system are going to be targeted, trying to go up to people, find out if they registered to vote, and if not, register them, because that's one of the ways you re-engage people in their community is you re-engage them in the political process. So that's something I'm going to be working on a fair amount this fall. The other thing right now in the state that's really important is the effort to change the bail laws.
Yes.
Right? So the issue of money bail,
Yes.
and anybody, if they're interested in this topic, should just Google Connecticut Bail Fund.
That's a great organization.
It's a great
We're
organization.
going to have them on soon. They're coming on
They're
soon.
very, very cool.
Yeah,
Yes.
and they're doing two things: trying to change the laws so that there are fewer people locked up. Because a lot of people in this state and in the country, people don't realize this. They assume if you're locked up, it's because you were convicted. A lot of people are locked up pre-trial. They're innocent. They're awaiting trial to find out if what's going to happen, and they're poor, and they can't post the bail amount. And so Connecticut Bail Fund is trying to change those laws. But the other thing they're doing is they're raising money. So they have a revolving fund. So you can contribute $5,
Yes.
$10,
Yes.
$15.
Yes.
That money will be used by them, and I've seen this work. It will be used by them to post bond for somebody who can't afford it. And here's the thing: it's a revolving fund. When the person goes back to court, the money gets
Comes
redeposited,
back,
so then it can be used for the next person.
Right,
Yes.
and I read it was surprising number of people, very, very few people actually default. So they're doing
Yeah.
very, very
Poor
Over
people.
well.
90%.
Poor people are not going to default.
Over 90%
yeah.
people come,
Right,
come, and
right.
so that's one of the myths is that if we don't make it impossible, if we don't impose this high tax on people, they're not going to come back. But people do.
Right,
All
but talking about bail bonds, isn't the United States one of the few places where we privatize bail bonds?
You said is Connecticut one of the few places?
No, United States. The country.
Yes. I mean, they're all right, exactly, and it makes no sense because it gives people an economic incentive to continue to. I mean, the theory is that these folks are going to make sure that the person comes back to court.
Right.
But the reality of it is they end up being people that continue to lobby for the existing laws. Right now, one of the biggest groups that's arguing against the change of the bail laws, of course, is the bail bonds
Yes.
because it's their industry.
It's their industry, Dave.
And that's the problem with bringing private dollars into this system to begin with is that then you create a constituency
Yes.
that argues for the perpetuation of the system.
Absolutely. Well, thank you so much.
Thank you.
I'm glad that you're hopeful because you know what? When I saw this title come out last year, whenever it came out, I was thinking, well, what is this going to be? Is this going to be like Boyce? Like, is this going to be? I'm so happy that it is not and that it is hopeful, that I feel hopeful reading this and that people will feel, and it's not academic in the sense that I don't feel like I'm reading your dissertation. I feel like you are talking to me. Do you know what I mean?
Well, I tried to write it that way. You know, I was a trial lawyer, and as a trial lawyer, you have to talk to jurors.
Yeah. So I felt like you were conscientious about how you wrote this book and how people will receive it. So thank you so much. It's been a pleasure talking to you.
Thank you. It's
And
been a lot of fun.
binge watching you. Thank you, Andrew, for riding shotgun today.
It was my pleasure.
I
Absolutely.
enjoyed it. So thank you all for listening. This is Criminal Justice Insider. We'll be back. Jeff, I hope you feel better. Today's show is brought to you by the Community Foundation for Greater New Haven, now more than ever, and Family Reentry. Thank y'all.
Thank you.
Thank you.